Howdy folks, welcome back to War Thunder with the mighty Jingles. I am flying the Grumman TBF Avenger, US Navy's premier torpedo bomber of the Second World War, although it could also carry quite a substantial bomb load, 2,000 pounds here in War Thunder. This aircraft was used by, obviously, the US Navy in the Second World War. It was also used by the Royal Navy. Whole range of different countries eventually ended up operating this aircraft. Uruguay, France, Canada, the Netherlands, and ironically enough, Japan actually used this aircraft in the 1950s and the 1960s. Avengers in Royal Navy service weren't called Avengers at first, and the British have an annoying habit of doing that. They get something American that has a cool name, and they seem to decide, nope, sorry, that name's far too flashy in Hollywood for us, we're going to call it something really boring. We did it in the first Gulf War. The build-up phase of the first Gulf War was known to most of the world by the American code name, Operation Desert Shield. And then when the shooting war started, it was known by the American code name, Operation Desert Storm. Meanwhile, in Britain, it was Operation Granby. Yeah. And we did this with the American aircraft that we used as well. The Grumman Wildcat in Royal Naval Service was known as the Grumman Martlet. It was even worse with the Avenger. I mean, how can you take an aircraft with a cool name like the Avenger and decide, no, sorry, that name is far too flashy for us, we're going to call this, you ready for this? The Tarpon. Oh, Britain, you so silly. Well, anyway, these absurd naming conventions didn't last very long, particularly when the Royal Navy started operating in a limited role in the Pacific with the US Navy against Japan, and to avoid confusion when operating with American aircraft, we just gave it up and started calling our aircraft by their proper names, the Wildcat, the Hellcat, and the Avenger. So anyway, I am in the Avenger. It's a Rank 2 American torpedo and light bomber. It has a battle rating of only 2.3. And it's arcade ground strike again, and it's same old, I'm afraid. I'm flying around here completely unmolested at 6,000 meters. Nobody's coming up to shoot me down, and I'm just flying around, dropping my bombs, knocking out bases. And I'm going to achieve 0 kills in this mission, and I'm going to win the game. Because, once again, enemy fighters are just not interested in coming up after me. And, you know, it's difficult to know who to blame for the situation in ground strike maps. I mean, everybody likes to point the finger and say, oh, it's the fault of the fighter pilots for not going after the bombers, and yeah, there's some truth to that. And you could say, oh, it's the fault of Gaijin for making it too easy to win a game by bombing out bases, and yeah, there's some truth to that. But I don't think it's fair to just point the finger in one direction. It's not very often in life you can point the finger at one particular issue and say, there you go, that's the source of the problem. There's usually a whole range of different factors that combine together to create an issue. And I think it's the same deal here in War Thunder with ground strike maps. First of all, you really do have to give credit where credit is due. It's not as if Gaijin have just ignored the issue and pretended that there isn't a problem in ground strike. They have made changes to ground strike, particularly the starting altitude of various different aircraft, and also the fact that you can no longer, it's not the bad old days of Year Thunder, when if you saw 4 Year 2s on the enemy team, you knew you were screwed because your airbase was going to be knocked out in the first 3 minutes of the game. Now you have to knock out the secondary ground bases before you can go for the airfield. But all that is really doing is delaying the inevitable. I mean, in that game, I finished 10th. It was boring as shit. I just flew around in circles, dropping bombs on target indicators on the ground. Nobody came up to shoot at me. Finished 10th, but I still got a good amount of XP and credits out of it. So, is that the fault of the enemy fighter pilots because they didn't climb up after me? Well, I don't know. Maybe. Here's a different game. This is the B-7A2. It's a Japanese dive bomber. It's a very, very good Japanese dive bomber. It carries, once it's fully upgraded, you can equip this thing with one of these babies, an 800 kilogram bomb. Now, it only has the one bomb, but it is 800 kilograms. The TBF Avenger gets 2,000 pounds of bombs. It gets 4 500-pound bombs. The B7, one 800 kilo bomb, but 800 kilos is the equivalent to 1,763 pounds of bombs. So it has a roughly comparable bomb load. And the difference is that the B7 here is also a dive bomber, so it doesn't have to stay level when it's dropping its bombs. Now in this game we're going to see enemy fighter pilots coming up after me. And the question that you're going to have to ask yourself when you see that eventually happen is, was it worth the effort? Because, you know, a lot of people argue with the recent changes made to ground strike and the fact that you do have to bomb out the ancillary bases before you go for the airstrip has given the fighter pilots more time to get up to altitude and do their job. And there is certainly truth in that argument. But at the same time, the fighter pilots are arguing, well, it's just not worth their time and effort to do it, because in the time it takes them to climb up to this kind of altitude, to possibly get one kill, the other guys on their team, and this is the same old problem, this hasn't changed, the other guys on the team are racking up all kinds of air kills down at low altitude. So the guys that are actually taking the mission seriously and coming after the high altitude bomber aircraft are really not being rewarded enough for it. At the very best, they're going to get one bomber kill. Is it really worth the amount of effort and time that it takes them to get up here and start shooting at me? I don't know. I'd argue that if you find yourself in the position of being the only fighter pilot climbing up after the bombers, then no, it is definitely not worth your time and effort to do it. You're going to lose anyway. One fighter pilot is not going to make enough of a difference. You may as well be farming as many air kills as you possibly can down at low altitude. But if enough people do it, you definitely can affect the outcome of the game. And the problem is, not enough people are doing it. So why are not enough people doing it? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. First and foremost, I really don't think Gaijin are incentivizing bomber kills highly enough. And for those of you for whom English isn't your first language, what that means is they're not making it worthwhile killing bombers. If bombers gave more credits and XP for a kill, perhaps, something like that, people would be going after the bombers more. And I'm not arguing for a nerf to the bombers. I think the bombers are finally in a position where they can actually do some good. And when they do come under attack, they're not just guaranteed easy kills anymore, which used to be the situation for far too long in War Thunder. So I really do think that the bombers are fine where they are. The problem is not with the bombers. The problem is that the fighter pilots are not going after the bombers. And the reason the fighter pilots aren't going after the bombers is because it's not worth their time going after the bombers. And that really is the secret to successful game design. If players are not playing your game the way you feel they should be, then you have to make it attractive to the players to play it in the way that is going to make the maps and the missions work. All too often you get developers seeing players doing things in a way that is different to the way the developers want it to happen, and they all too often take a very heavy-handed and clumsy approach to fixing it. I'll give you an example. In World of Warcraft, during the Burning Crusade expansion, a lot of Holy Paladin healers were stacking as much haste and crit as they could get on their gear, and the reason they were doing this was to do with the way the game mechanics worked. Whenever their heals critted, they got 60% of the resources that they used for that heal back. Well, it did make Paladin healers, certainly in the early stages of the Burning Crusade, very, very effective. Perhaps a little too effective. Blizzard Entertainment addressed this by taking all of the crit and haste off the next tier of Paladin gear. The Paladins responded to this by not using any of that Paladin gear. And Blizzard's response was to change the way the game mechanics worked, and so that the Paladins were saying, no, we don't want to use any of that gear, it's useless for the way that we heal. And Blizzard was saying, well, but we want you to heal this way. No, well, we don't want to heal that way. Well, we're going to make you heal that way, whether you like it or not. And they changed the game mechanics so that the gear that they were currently equipped, which was very, very effective for casting very fast and high crit heals, suddenly became useless. And Paladin healers for the remainder of the Burning Crusade expansion were pretty shit. Well, that's a terrible way to approach game design. If instead they had made it more attractive to Paladin healers to change the way they healed and fit in with the vision that Blizzard had for the way Paladin healers should work. That would have just been a much, much better approach all around. Everybody would have been happy, but instead they alienated all of the Holy Paladins. And I think that this is the kind of approach that Gaijin need to be making here in War Thunder, particularly with the problem of fighter pilots refusing to go after high-altitude bombers in ground strike maps. If you make it worth their time to go after the bombers, they will go after the bombers. If it becomes a far, far better way of earning XP and credits, that's exactly what they'll do. And at the moment, it just isn't. I think what they need to do, and you know, your opinion may differ, but I think they definitely need to perhaps give a much, much bigger XP and credit bonus for achieving the Ground Force Rescuer award, for example, for killing bombers. At the same time, I think they also need to incentivize protecting your bombers and give a much higher XP and credit bonus for the Bomber Rescuer award. Ideally, you want to end up with a situation where on a ground strike map, the bombers are going after the ground targets, and the bombers are doing that because that's their job. But at the same time, the interceptors are going after the bombers, and the interceptors should be doing that because that's their job. And at the same time, the fighters are protecting the bombers and taking out the interceptors because that should be their job. But it's just not happening at the moment, and the only reason it's not happening is because it's not worth anybody's time and effort. If you make it worth their time and effort, they will do it. The game will play the way it's supposed to play. And I'll show you exactly why the game currently doesn't play out like that. We've just bombed out all of the ancillary bases, and now I'm lining up to drop my 800 kilo bombs on the airfield. It has been boring as shit, but it is undeniably effective. It wins games. And there. An I-185. Now, I am nearly 8,000 meters up here. It must have taken that guy the best part of 4 or 5 minutes to climb to this altitude. And all I do now, I'm a dive bomber, is I go into a dive. That guy is doing what he should be doing. You know, he's seen how effective I have been at altitude. Nobody else is bothering themselves to come up here and get me. So he just wasted half of his game coming up to do what needed to be done. If he wants to kill me, he's now going to have to sacrifice all of the time and effort that he put in to climbing up there. If there are any other bombers up there, he's got to make a choice. Come down after me and give up all of that height, or go after another bomber and watch them do exactly the same thing. And even if he does follow me down and kill me, all I do is jump into another bomber. And then he's got to spend the next 5 minutes climbing back up to interception altitude in order to take me out again. And it's just not rewarding enough for fighter pilots. And that's why they don't do it. You know, it's simple economics here, folks. It's not rocket science. You make it worth their time and effort, they will do it. At the moment, if you are the only guy climbing up after the bombers, it's just a waste of time. If more pilots climbed up after the bombers would have a much, much harder time. The bombers would then start crying that they're constantly getting swarmed by fighters, and then you therefore obviously need to make it more attractive for the fighters to protect the bombers from the interceptors, and that's the only way this is ever going to work. Bigger incentives need to be given to fighter and interceptor pilots to do their jobs. You make it worth their time, they'll do it. Currently, it isn't. Changing the mechanics to make it impossible to just bomb the airbase out right at the start is only delaying the inevitable. All it's doing is giving the fighter pilots more time to pad their stats with more fighter kills. They're still not going after the bombers. You have to make it worth their effort to go after the bombers. You have to make it worth the effort of the friendly fighters to defend the bombers from the other fighters. Otherwise, people are just not going to do it. And they're not doing it because it ain't worth their time. But hey, what do I know? I'm not a game developer. Let me know what you think in the comments. And in the meantime, watch your six. I'll catch you next time.